Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitchin, and this is block 3 of our parables quilt along. Block 3 is the parable New Wine in an Old Wineskin. For this block, we're going to end up with a 4-inch finished block that looks like a wine glass, very appropriate. I show it here with both the colorways that I'm doing my full quilt and here with the alternate setting pattern that we have. Let's get started. All right, if you would please join me in prayer. Merciful Father, you have shown me that my old life is gone and my new life is found with you. I'm thankful not to dwell on my past mistakes and relive those awful times. I'm thankful to follow you and the path that you have created for me. Like your disciples, I pray I will share the good news of new life in Christ with everyone. Allow me to shine the light of Christ so others will draw closer to you. Amen. Let's take a look at the pattern. On page 1 of the pattern, in the upper left-hand corner, are the fabric requirements and the cutting instructions. This is such a small block that you can just use scraps if you like for this. The pattern includes the parable from Mark 2:22, and then a devotional message about the parable. At the bottom of page 1, I include a prayer that you can use while you're making your block or before or after. Page 2 of the pattern includes all of the instructions, including the pressing instructions. This is such a small unit, you need to make sure that you're measuring each piece and that your pieces are matching up with the measurements indicated in the pattern. And the last page of the pattern indicates why I chose a wine glass to represent this particular parable, and a space for you to write your own personal reflection. It can be a reflection on your personal faith experience with this parable, your quilting experience, or your own personal faith journey. Just a space for you to write your reflection. Let's take a look at fabric choices. I am constructing 2 different colorways of quilts, so I have 2 different sets of fabric choices. You're going to want to make sure that you have significant contrast between the wine and the wine glass. And if you're using directional fabrics, you must be very careful about how you cut your unit so that the direction goes the way that it needs to in the overall design. I chose this peppercorn fabric because it has some golds and reds in it. And then this will be my wine. Neither one are directional, so this should be fairly simple to cut. In my other colorway, quite a bit brighter, I chose this turquoise and it has some dots to it, but it's not directional. And my wine is going to be a lime green. In my independent block, they will be in an alternative setting. I chose a darker turquoise for the fabric for my wine glass, and I chose kind of a loud print here. I thought it looked kind of like the swirls of a margarita. This is going to go in my car, so I didn't necessarily need to have it look like wine. I just wanted it to match the other units that are going with my background fabric. Block 3, New Wine in an Old Wineskin, is a very simple 2-color block with the background fabric. It's not necessary that your background has to be the same background as blocks 2 and 4 and 5, but it can be. It won't necessarily go on the quilt right next to them, but it can. There will be an area of the quilt where 4 4-inch units will be next to each other. The important point is that when you're choosing fabrics for the small squares in your overall quilt, that the fabrics that you choose have a similar value and enhance rather than take away from your Jesus the Teacher unit. The pattern calls for 2-inch squares, 1 3/4 by 2-inch rectangles, and 1 1/4-inch squares. So I'm going to cut a strip that is 2 inches. I like to use a ruler that has perforated lines so that I can see exactly where my fabric is. When I'm working with small units, I like to make sure I can see exactly where my fabric falls so that when I make that cut, I know that it's true. I want to square the edge before I cut my subunits. And I'm always using my ruler to make my cuts, not the mat. The mat may not be necessarily true as far as the measurement goes. So I'll cut my 2-inch units first, making sure I'm square on all sides of my cut. Then my 1 3/4 units. And you can see this is where having the perforated edges really comes in handy. And I can use the remainder of this to cut my 1 1/4 pieces, and I can just set that aside. The rest of the background fabric, I'll use that later in another block. I'm cutting for 2 different colorways here, so I've got them stacked on top of each other, and I'll be cutting out my wine unit. Before I do any cutting, I need to cut off that selvage. It's really important to always get your selvage off so that you don't make the mistake and to try to incorporate it into any area of your quilt. The selvage will actually damage your quilt when you're washing it because it shrinks faster than the rest of the quilt. Now, my wine in this particular case does not need to be fussy cut. When I cut from my unit here, I did fussy cut my wine so I could get those swirls into the wine itself. But these 2 fabrics, neither one require a fussy cut. I need a 1.5 inch wide unit. And again, I like to use it with a perforated measurement. Once I have that 1.5 inch wide, I can go ahead and take this unit and cut it to 4.5 inches. Square the end. Spin the unit around and cut to 4.5 inches. And I make sure that it's nice and square on all of the sides. My wine is cut. Time to go ahead and cut the wine glass. If any of your fabrics need pressing before you cut, make sure that you do that. You don't want to make a cut and have it not be cut straight because your unit needed to be pressed. I have 2 layers of fabric for both of my colorways here, and I've cut them to 1.5 inches because they're not directional. I'm going to go ahead and subcut those down to the 1 1/4 because I have 2 layers. So I'm going to get the 2 units that I need first. Spin that around, cut to 1 1/4 inches. Set those aside. And now from the remaining pieces, I will cut the other units that I need. So I can see that I have all of my units, they're the right sizes, and I'm ready to go ahead and construct my block. I'm going to go ahead and leave my design laid out on this mat. And when I need to make cuts, I'm just going to slide another mat right on top of it. So we're going to begin with step 1, where it calls to take the wine and the wine glass, fold them over like a sandwich, and stitch 1/4 inch down the side. I'll take these units over to my machine, and I'll cover up the rest of my design with another mat. And I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch. Now, typically, you would only have 1 block. If you're only making 1 block, you can't chain piece, but I'm making 2 blocks, so I'll chain piece my units through. The pattern calls in step 1 for you to press this unit open. I'm going to begin by just setting both seams, just setting the iron on the seams just to set the seams. Then I'll open one of the units and use my fingers to spread it apart and I will finger press that seam open, making sure that my unit is nice and square. It's really important in your overall block to make sure your unit remains square, and it will only do that if you make it square. I'll set a nice hot iron on it for 5 seconds. This is an iron without steam because steam can introduce stretch into the unit, and in a 4-inch square block, you don't have room for a stretch. When I finish, the pattern says that my unit should measure 2.5 by 4.5, and I double check the size to make sure that my unit measures correctly, and it does. I'll go ahead and place both units back onto my design mat. That way I make sure I have my wine in the correct location before I move on to the next step. In the next step, the pattern calls for you to mark a diagonal line on the wrong side of your 2-inch square. And you can do this with a ruler and a pencil or chalk, and mark your line that way. Or the method that I like to use, because it's nice and quick, is I will take my 2-inch square and I will fold it with the wrong sides together, finger press it with my iron, and I'm going to stitch on that pressed line. By pressing that mark into the square, I can stitch right on that pressed line. The pattern calls for you to stitch those on both sides of your wine and glass unit. When stitching to the sides of your wine and glass unit, it's important to make sure that you're placing the square on your wine corner, and use an open-toed foot so you can see where you're going. Not necessary to use a pin, but you're welcome to use one if you like. You'll stitch right on that diagonal line. Step 2 of the pattern calls for you to trim that seam to 1/4 of an inch. But before I do that, I double check to make sure I've sewn my half squares across the wine section and not the wine glass. That unit looks good, as does that unit. So I can go ahead and trim those. I will do that by placing the 1/4 inch mark of a ruler directly on that seam, and then cutting a 1/4 inch outside the seam. Now, some quilters like to go ahead and just cut with their scissors, and you can certainly do that, but I like the way a nice true 1/4 inch seam, when it's pressed into the unit, the way that it helps the unit to keep its shape, lay flat, and quilt nicely. Having that original wine and glass seam pressed open allows for us to have the half square lay nice and flat when we have that pressed. The pattern calls for these to press to the outside. You simply set the seam with your iron for 5 seconds and then press it to the outside. Again, holding that dry iron in place for 5 seconds. If you have stitched and pressed correctly, your unfinished unit should measure 2.5 by 4.5 inches. So you should measure it first before you move on to the next step. That one measures correctly, as does that one. I'll go ahead and lift my mat off of my palette and lay these units back in place to make sure, once again, that I have them stitched in the correct order. The next piece that we will do is we will take the 1 3/4 inch center sections and we will run those through our machine at 1/4 inch on both sides. We're going to press this unit open. Once I have that center section of the stem of the wine glass stitched, I set the seam on both sides, making sure I don't press a crease into my unit. And then I'll finger press that open before I press the seam open. The first thing I'll do is make sure that I have it straight on my mat. I'll pull it open with my fingers, spreading that out. And then I'll use my fingernail or thumbnail to finger press those seams open. Again, I have it nice and straight. I can see it straight vertically as well as horizontally before I just set the iron on there for 5 seconds. And there's my unit. It's nice and straight. If your unit doesn't come out straight, it's either because you didn't hold it straight in the first place or because your 1/4 inch isn't straight, not even on both ends. A little bit of a finger press there and get my unit nice and straight and hold the iron in place. Take the units and lay them in place on my design mat, and I'm ready to go on to the next step. In step 4, we're going to make very small half square triangles. We'll use the same method that we did before. We'll either press the half squares together with wrong sides together, or we can use the ruler and a pencil and mark the diagonal on the wrong side. Do that on your background units. So you'll have 2 units for each wine glass to do that with. I have chosen to press my half square units rather than mark them. So I'm going to go ahead and run them through my machine now, opening it up, making sure that my right sides are together, and I'm going to stitch diagonally along that pressed line. Just as we did in step 2, we're going to trim these half squares to 1/4 inch. So I'll use my ruler, place my 1/4 inch directly on that seam line, and trim to 1/4 inch. The pattern calls to press these units open. We'll do that by first finger pressing and then holding the iron for 5 seconds on the seam. Each of these units should measure 1 1/4 inch square. So before you go on to the next step, it's important to measure them. Those 2 worked out fine. If they don't measure 1 1/4 inch, you need to figure out what you need to do with your seam, or you need to square your unit up to 1 1/4 inch. It's time to sew the base of the wine glass together. So you'll look at your picture and put your units onto your design mat in the proper order. And once you have them laid out so that the stem of your glass is going the direction that it should, you can go ahead and stitch these pieces together using 1/4 inch. Step 5 of the pattern calls to press each of these seams open. They're very small and it's kind of hard to do, but it's important to go ahead and first finger press them open. That will help a lot in getting them to press open. With each one that you finger press, make sure that you're keeping your unit nice and straight. If you see that you have any part of your seams where your 1/4 inch has trailed off or gotten too fat, now's the time to fix it before you press it. So I have finger pressed my units open, and now I'm going to go ahead and press simply by setting my iron in place for 5 seconds. And you can see I press a nice straight unit. It is straight both horizontally and vertically. And I flip it over and press it from the front again, just to make sure that I have that nice and straight. Then I'll take my units, lay them on my design mat, make sure I have the stem of my wine glass going the proper direction, and now it's time to go ahead and sew the units together. When I flip my wine glass unit over onto the actual stem, I'm going to pin the outside edges of my unit. And then I am going to make sure that my wine lines up the diagonal at 1/4 inch. If I put my pin through, it should come directly through the seam of the stem of the wine glass. So I'll go ahead and pin those units. And because we have cut our pieces at 1/4 inch, another way to double check is that diagonal seam should match up perfectly with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Put the needle through, it catches the seam, and I'm ready to go ahead and piece that unit. If we pinned and stitched that correctly, when we open up the unit, the stem should line up nicely with the wine. And we're going to press this seam towards the stem. The last section of the unit will simply match seams on the wine stem, and I'll place a pin in those seams. When I place a pin through the seam, it should come directly through the seam on the other side. And I will also pin the outside edges. If I have pinned and stitched that correctly, my stem should match up with my half squares there, and they do. I'm going to press this towards the center, so I'll turn the unit over, set the seam, open it up, and press to the center, holding the iron in place for 5 seconds. I like to go ahead and just iron those. And the last thing I'll do is I will edge stitch around the edge, but only after I have measured my unit to make sure that my block measures 4.5 inch square. When I edge stitch this unit, I'm going to stitch about a 1/16 or a scant 1/8 of an inch all the way around the edge of the unit, because I'm going to be handling this unit several times as I'm moving it around on my finished quilt. So I want to make sure that it stays nice and square and doesn't get all wonky because of the extra seams that we have in it. And while I do all of my stitching with a dry iron, when I have finished my unit, sometimes I'll give it a little squirt of just regular distilled water. I don't use a starch. And I'll give it one real good press. That little bit of water will set those seams nicely and make sure they're all pressed nice and straight. You can see I've got a nice flat unit that I'm dealing with now. And I have stitched a 1/16 of an inch all the way around that unit, so that as I handle these multiple times, they won't get floppy or they won't open up at the seams. And now we have finished block 3, new wine in an old wineskin. You can see with my 4-inch blocks laid here on the quilt that the fabrics that I've chosen with the values and the colors that they have, they enhance rather than take away from my block 1. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send an email, or post a message to our Facebook page, and somebody will be happy to get back to you. Thank you and have a blessed day.